Hello again, welcome to today's class. Today we'll be talking about, we'll be creating API views with the Django REST framework. Okay, and we're going to create API views to allow our users to register. Okay, and we're also going to create an API view to list all our users, and also another API view to get user details. Okay, so we'll be walking through the following steps. Step 1 will be to modify the project-wide Django REST framework authentication backend. So that means we will be modifying the settings. Okay, but before we get to that, we want to start a new app, Django app, API app. So this is my current folder structure. Local is the virtual environment. I want to activate that. Okay, and we change directory into the Django project folder. And I want to create a new Django app, okay, called API. But I don't want to put it inside the apps folder because API is not really, it's going to serve multiple functions, okay, so it's going to be like an entry point into our application. So I prefer to put it at a higher level directory, which is in the same folder as manage.py. So use Django admin start app API. And I'm just going to register that in settings. Check API apps API config. Okay, and next thing to do will be to modify the Django REST framework authentication backend. So basically we do that by adding a new config to the setting. So we can specify a couple of defaults that Django REST is going to use automatically when working with views or handling requests. So I'm specifying some defaults for authentication classes. So the first is going to be session authentication, which is the default authentication that Django provides. So it works by storing cookies on the user's computer. Next would be basic authentication. Okay, so basic authentication is when we allow users to pass their username and password as a base 64 encoded header in the request, HTTP request, and then we use that to basically perform authentication. Next would be token authentication. So Django REST framework comes in with an inbuilt token authentication, which allows users to authenticate by passing a token in the HTTP header. Okay, so we're going to be working with the three of this for this project. Just mind you that authentication is different from authorization. Okay, so authentication allows us to identify user's identity. Okay, and when we talk about authorization, authorization allows us to restrict access. Okay, so authentication is used to identify users. Authorization is used to restrict access or permission. Okay, so we've modified the project-wide Django REST authentication backend. Next would be to add the REST framework URLs to project-wide configuration URL config. Okay, so the simple include so path API auth include and by adding this is just going to give us access to some default REST framework views that Django REST framework comes with by default to help us browse our API basically and to configure our API. So by adding this, we get an inbuilt login and logout view. So you can actually just view that. Go to manage the file on server. Interesting. Okay, so I forgot to install REST framework. So that's pip install Django REST framework. Okay, now we can run the server again. Awesome. So we can navigate to localhost API auth. Okay. So by default, Django REST framework provides a login and logout view. So you can use that to perform session authentication. Interesting. Okay, so I forgot to add REST framework to my list of installed apps. Awesome. So you can also log in. I'm going to go ahead and create a new super user. Okay, super user at email.com. You can actually use any email now because this database or this user detail won't be used in production. Okay, and I'm going to type in a password. Yeah, so you can use that to log in now. Okay, and back to API auth. So we don't have any API views yet, but then we've successfully logged in. Okay, so you can also visit the Django admin page, and we see we're also logged in with superuser@email.com. So Django REST framework just provides an inbuilt login and logout views to help us work with session authentication. Okay. Next thing to do would actually be to write the test for the views we want to create. Okay, so we're going to take a test driven approach to today's class. Okay, and so basically we want to write tests for our API views. So I'm just going to create a new test folder. After that, I'm going to add an init and we'll have test views. We don't really have models in our API because it's more of a wrapper library and entry point application. Okay, so we'll just mostly be testing views and maybe permissions and serializers. Okay, so the actual code for the test is a bit long, so I want to try that beforehand. So let me walk us through it quickly. Okay, so first thing we import the Django reverse function. Okay, so that just basically takes in view's name, okay, and then reverses the URL for that corresponding view. We import the get user model utility to get the current user model for our application. Okay, we also imported the API test case from Django REST, from the REST framework library. Okay, so this is actually the core of our whole test. So it provides a class similar to the unit test class that allows us to test our views. Okay, and this is the force authenticate from REST framework test as well, that allows us to basically manually force or create a new session for a user detail, so we can basically log in as that user and perform tests or perform operations as that user. Then we import the status module and the token module too for when we implement token authentication. We also import secrets. So secret is a Python package that allows us to create cryptographically secure strings, random strings basically. So we use that to generate passwords for our dummy users. Okay, so we have the user register list test, which inherit from API test case, and we basically have a setup test data method which gets called before any of the other tests gets called, and we just basically create some users for our testing purposes. So a super user, a staff account, and 2 normal users, okay, to compare experiences. So we also test user registration. So when we create that user registration view, we test that it works. So users passing their details and a new user gets created. We also test that some basic properties of our business logic, which is that only the admin can view all the users. Okay, so only admin can view the user list. And we also test that any user can view other users' details. So as per our business logic, only admins can view all users in the application. Then any user can view user details as well. Then we test only user or super user can edit user details. Finally, we test that a user can get a token. So we basically reverse the API, the URL, using the views name, and we use the API clients to retrieve that URL and pass it the data. So this is going to get JSON encoded. Again, we just assert that the response status code is successful and that the token is also successful as well. So at the moment, none of these tests should be passing. So we can actually run that. Test API app. Okay. Interesting. Test G. Okay, this wasn't saved. Run that again. Again, all of them fail, which is as you expect because we have not yet created all of that. Okay, so next step would be to actually create permissions to model our expected behavior. So we wanted that basically only users can view so a user can sign up. That means the user will create a new profile. A user can edit his own details, but he shouldn't be able to edit any other user's details. We also want admins to be able to delete user accounts that they feel are faulty. Okay, and then as a super user, you should be able to perform all operations. So that's the logic we want to encode. In addition to that, we also want to have a list of all the users in our application, okay, for maybe monitoring purposes, and that should only be accessible by the admin or to the admin. Okay, so that those are the conditions we want to enforce in our application. And to do that, we have to write a custom Django REST framework permission. Okay, so we're going to go to API. We're going to create a new file, permissions.py. Okay, and first up, we're going to import permissions module. We're going to create a new class is creator or admin read only. Again, this is going to inherit from the permissions.base permission class. So this is how we create new permissions. Okay, and so we just have to define a new function. The object has object permission, which gets called each time we retrieve an object in our view. Okay, and this is where we're going to put the logic for our conditions. Okay, so first one is if it's a safe method, which means that if it's a get method, maybe any other user wants to view a user's detail, so we should allow that to happen. So that's usually a get request. Okay, so if it's a safe method, either a get, a head, or options HTTP request, we allow them true. So that's if request dot method in permissions dot safe methods, we return true. So return true means we give them permission. If request dot user is staff, okay, so if it's a staff, we want them to be able to delete, we want them to be able to create, but we do not want them to be able to delete, to edit other users' details. Okay, so we want to give users autonomy of their own data. So if we find their data offensive, we can delete it, but we can't edit it. So we want to create a small iterable or tuple to track edit methods basically. So if request is, if the user is a staff and he didn't try to make an edit method or an edit request, we return true as well. Finally, if it's a super user, return true. And if the request user is equal to the retrieved user object, okay, so the object is going to be the retrieved user object, which in our case would be our custom user model. And so if the authenticated user is the same as the instance of the custom user model, we should return access as well. So just like that, we've created our custom permission for our view set for the user view. Okay, can take that off. Next would be to create custom input and output serializers. So what are serializers in Django REST framework? Serializers are what taking any data, okay, and pass and validate that data for us. So whenever we accept external JSON or any other format, it's serializers that taking that data and return useful functions or attributes we can use within our application. So serializers would parse our model instances to JSON or accept JSON and validate that JSON as well. So we're going to create two serializers actually. One to be used when we're trying to create users, and the other to be used when we're displaying user details. Okay. So we're going to create a new file, serializers.py. Okay, and we want to import the serializer module from REST framework. Okay, and we start user input serializer the model. Okay, so we're using the model serializer, which basically infers all the fields from the model that it's passed. Okay, so we can get that model using the django.contrib.auth get user model function. I'm just going to fetch that up there. Yeah. So class meta model is equal to user model, and the fields we want to accept in our inputs are email. So user must specify an email when signing up. You have to specify a first name, last name as well. Because first name and last name are used when we're creating our slugs. Password and the confirmation password field as well. And finally, a slug with data intent, so users can specify a slug when they're signing up. Remember that slug serves as our username for our application. Okay, but then we have to also tell the serializer that because password 2 field is not inbuilt on our model, so we have to specify which field exactly exists in our model and how they should behave. So firstly, we want to specify that there should be a validation on the password the user enters. So we want to use the inbuilt Django password validation to make sure that the password is valid and strong enough for our application. Okay, so we want to import the Django password validator from Django contrib.auth password validation import password validate password. Okay, and then we can use that in our serializer. So just specifying custom behavior for our password field. Okay, and we say write only, it's true, which means that this field will only show up when we're trying to write or create a new instance of an object, but it won't show when we're passing out data. Okay, and it should be a required field. And we want to say that validators should make use of the validate password from Django. And password 2 field, we just want to make sure that it's also write only as well. Also, we want to make sure that the slug is not a required field. So some of this logic is already on our model field, but then it's always good to have an extra safety net. Of the field required is true. We want all users to specify last name and first name when signing up. Okay, and the whole purpose of the password 2 field is to make sure that the user specified the same password twice, so they didn't make a mistake first time. And so we have to perform a bit of validation to ensure that that actually happens. So we override the validate method of our serializer and just perform a basic check that password 1 original password field is equal to password 2 field, and if it's not, we raise an error. Okay, and it should be a dictionary, so password, which is field the error coding, password fields as much. Yeah, and then we just call the default behavior of validate, which is by calling super. And just like that, we're done with the input serializer for our user model. Next is our output serializer. Okay, and we just much simpler serializer, just specify the model we're using, which is the user model, and the fields it should show, which is the email, the first name of the user, last name, and the user's log. That's all the information we want to return back whenever somebody asks for a user's detail. Okay, Next step would be to create user view set and to add some custom permissions to reflect our logic. So we can go into views. We're not going to need render. Okay, and we can import the framework view sets. Okay. I'm going to make use of the model view set. So user view set, which inherits from view set model view set. So model view set is just going to provide us a list of all the CRUD endpoints or actions by default. So we get the automatic create, read, update, retrieve, and delete or destroy endpoints. Okay, but we want to override a couple of them to perform some more logic. Okay, so first of all, we can cage the user model. Okay, so user model objects.all. I also want to provide a default serializer class, which should be by default our user output serializer. Take note we haven't imported that yet, so we can just import that. Okay, and we can also define a list of serializer classes. We'll use it our view set. So for the create endpoint, we will use the serializers dot user input serializer. Okay, and for every other operation, we're going to use the default serializer class. Okay, and the next thing we need to do is to override the permissions model of our view set. Okay, so that it reflects or changes permissions based on our logic. Okay, so if depending on the operation the user is performing, we change the permissions of our view. Okay, so first one, if self the action, which would either be create, list, retrieve, or destroy. So that coincides with the CRUD idea of like create, read. Okay, retrieve, there should be update. Okay, so create, retrieve, update, and destroy. CRUD again, then there's a list. So if self the action is equal to create, our permission class should allow anybody to sign up basically. Okay, and so we want to use the default or inbuilt permissions from REST framework, so we can import that from REST framework. Import permissions. Again, while we're at it, we can also import our custom permissions from .import permissions or from .permissions import is creator. Okay, and we can use that right here. So permissions dot allow any. Okay, and elif self dot action is equal to retrieve permission classes is equal to permissions dot authenticated. Okay, is authenticated. So what that means is that when a user tries to retrieve a user's details, okay, so maybe they're querying for a particular user's details, they will get that user's details as long as they are authenticated. Okay, and next condition, self.action in, so if self.action is any of updates, partial update, which is called when we make a patch request, and destroy permission classes. First of all, we add our custom permission, which is creator. Okay, and also is authenticated as well. So we want to keep out unauthenticated users from making any edits or changes to a user's details. Okay, next would be the list view. So if self.action is equal to list permission classes equal to permissions dot is admin, so only admin can access the list endpoint of all our users. Okay, and else we just want to set it as only admin. So if there's any other action, unexpected action a user can make, we want to make sure that it's only admins that can access it. So is admin user. Okay, and we can just return a list of all our permissions, instantiated instances of our permission classes. So we're done with creating custom permissions for our view sets. Okay, and now what we want to do is we want to modify the create view for our view sets. Okay, so when users register, we want them to specify the fields they're registering with, and we want to basically perform a bit of validation on that before we save the user model. So we're going to override the create function or attribute method of our view set. Okay, and so this is same as user sign up basically. Okay, so we want to allow anyone to sign up. Okay, so that's without authentication. We've already captured that in our get permissions function. So we can just call self.check permissions since we're overriding the default class. Okay, and then we can instantiate our serializer. With the data we received from the post request. So create is by default called with post data. Okay, and we have to show that that's data. So data is equal to request or post. So if serializer is valid, that means there are no errors. If there are, there should be exceptions. If serializer is valid, then we go ahead to create a new user. Create user. Okay, and we just specify the fields we want to create. So email is equal to serializer validated data email. Same for first name. Last name. Password. Okay, and then we also want to return the response of the newly created user. Okay, so we want to serialize that with our output serializer. And get the data attribute of that, which is going to be a dictionary. And we can return that response. A JSON response actually, so we need to import the response class from REST framework. Okay, and we should also specify proper status, HTTP status. Okay, so let's import that as well. You know what, we can find this in here. And status should equal to status 200 HTTP 200.201 because we just created an entity. Okay, and you can actually try that out. So we can go to, okay, let's register our view set in the urls.py. So we have to create a new urls.py. Okay, and from REST framework.routers import default router. So our router is equal to default router. Okay, we can import our view. So we can register our users view sets rather. Again, the base name, because if we leave the base name, it's going to be custom user, which is not very user friendly. So we can change that. So instead of the model name, we can specify a custom base name. So in this case, we can set it as user. Okay, and then we can say URL patterns, because Django is going to look for the URL patterns variable in each of our apps is equal to router.url. Okay, and we can also configure that in our project url.py. So everything ending after API should be passed on to our API.urls. Okay, and we're good to go. Yeah, users. Okay, I think users will be a better name. So we'll change that in our urls.py. Okay, so we also forgot to override the get serializer class method in our view sets. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. So it's actually very simple. We want to just specify that the serializer class should change based on the type of view or the type of action that is being performed. So get serializer class. I want to return the serializer class type. Okay, so we have a dictionary already of serializer classes. Okay, and based on the action that is being performed, we want to return that serializer. So self.serializer classes dot get self.action. Okay, and then the default serializer class should be returned. So self.default serializer class, and that should fix that. Awesome. So we get the list of all users. As you can see, I'm already signed in as a super user. Okay, so if I weren't, I'd be unable to see it. Okay, but we can still log in. Okay, so I'm going to log in as super user. But I'm going to create a new user. So we can call it user or normal user 1@email.com. Normal user and password. Awesome, so we created a new superuser. So I can log out from my superuser account, sign in as normal user. Again, you see I don't have permission to view the list of all users. Okay, so then how do we test our create user view? We can use the Python request module actually to test our API. Okay, so if you want to use request module, you have to run pip install request from your shell. Okay, so this should be a shell command. Okay, so I want to import the request module, and our URL is API users. So I want to create a new user model. So first of all, we have to specify the user's data. So we need, and like we specified in our serializer, we accept an input of an email, first name, last name, password, password 2, and slug. So we need to specify all that data in our request. So email will be test@email.com, first name test, last name, user, password, test user 1, password 2, test user 1 again, and we leave slug blank because slug is not required. Okay, so now we make a push request to our URL, and you see data is equal to user data, so that's going to encode our data as JSON and post it. Again, we get response 201, which means our response was successful and a new entity was created. And we see a default slug was also created for our user, slug being our user's username. Okay, so we know that our post endpoint is working. We also want to modify our retrieve endpoint basically, so that we can allow only users to modify their details. Okay, so I'll mark this as complete. So create is same as registration, and we can modify retrieve. So we go to retrieve. Okay, and retrieve is going to accept a primary key as an identifier. But what we want to do is we want to make it possible that you can either retrieve a user's details via slug or via primary identifier or ID. Okay, so what we do is that first of all we check if primary key is a valid slug. Okay, so we take preference to retrieving users by slug. So user is equal to user model dot objects dot filter slug is equal to primary key, and we want the first of that. Okay, so instead of using the get model, which would throw an error if we don't retrieve an object, we use the filter. Okay, so this could be none if we don't find any user with the slug primary, which is equal to pk. And so if not user, which is user is none. Okay, and pk is a digit, so pk is going to be a string by default. Okay, so if a valid pk was passed, it should be a string, and we want to check whether that string is an actual digit. So we determine that the user is trying to access it by primary key. So find user by primary key /id. So user is equal to user model dot objects dot filter, pk is equal to pk dot first. Okay, and next thing you have to do is you have to check or call our permission. Since we're overriding the default, you have to check object permissions that this user has access to the user model, and that's just going to call our permission class and perform all of that validation. Finally, we're going to return a response of our user object. So user output serializer. Our instance is our user. Okay, I'm going to return a response. Response status is equal to status. So we need to import status. Okay, we already imported that. Okay, and we can basically use that to check. So we are signed in as normal user 1. Okay, that was a mistake. We should pass the data, not the serializer instance. So we want to return a dictionary. Okay, and we see that we can view the user's details, but we can't edit. Okay, next user is super user, which is not our user because I'm currently signed in as normal user. So we can view the user details, but we can't edit again. Okay, and then we see this is our own user, normal user, and so we can edit. And we have a slug, so we can try maybe editing our slug. Okay, we can make a patch request with the following data. Change our slug to maybe awesome user, and that was successful. Okay, but we can't do that to any of the other users. Okay, so that means that our test or our permissions are working. Okay, and we should be able to run our test now and see a couple of them passing. Okay, so we forgot to add an app name to our URLs or price so that it's easy to reverse. And you can try that again. Awesome, so we only get one error, which should be coming from the token authentication test. Okay, so now to implement token authentication, because at the moment we can only authenticate with session and via basic authentication. Okay, so basic authentication would be basically passing the username and password via the HTTP header. Okay, you can try that out now. Okay, it's request. Interesting. Okay, HTTP basic auth. And you want a username and a password, so we can use the username we created last time. So that would be, in our case, username would be equal to email. So test@email.com. Again, password would be testuser1. And that is the HTTP class. Okay, and then we can make a post request, or we can modify the user slug. Okay, so this was the slug we got initially, and we can make a patch request to our URL. So we can retrieve the user by slug. There's nothing to test. Okay, and we get the right user. Okay, so we can retrieve user by slug, which is what we want to do now. So request dot hatch. Okay, and the URL should be and now slug is okay, and our authentication is equal to the authentication HTTP basic authentication, and the data we want to pass should be slug should become test or some API. Okay, and this okay, and we get denied. Okay, let's try this using user ID. Okay, interesting. So that was successful. Seems to be a bug. You see that the user's slug has been changed. Can try that again. See that it has been changed. Okay. Next thing to do would be to actually activate token authentication. So we can go to our settings.py. I'm going to add a new app. First framework auth token. Okay, and we want to perform migrations. And just have to create a new token retrieve endpoint for our user since we've already added token authentication to our authentication backend. Okay, so you want to go to the API app under URLs, and we want to add a new URL. Okay, so from first framework dot auth token dot use import obtain auth token. Okay, and paths get token or token. Okay, we use the view obtain auth token, and the name of the view should be get token. Okay, we also have to import paths from Django URLs. So you can actually test that. Note we have to use basic authentication to retrieve our token. Okay, so let's start the server. Again, it should have been a GET request to a URL or the post, and we should pass the user's credentials as JSON. Remember that username in our case will be email, so test@email.com. And password test user1. Okay. Interesting. Test at email. Test user1. Okay, seems we're making a URL request to the wrong endpoint, so it shouldn't be users. Awesome, and we have a 200 response, and if we check the JSON, we see the user's token. Okay, so the way we use token authentication is just to create a header, authorization, and then we paste this. Again, with this we should be able to perform the same operation we performed last time, which is the patch. Okay, so test all some API capitals. Okay, and let's give that a shot. Interesting. So that was an error. User 4. Authorization. What is the spelling? Quick check to the test file. Yeah, so that's how we create token authentication, and we can basically test that, run all our tests that they are running. The header doesn't seem to be working for some reason. So all our tests ran successfully. Just going to go to the admin and see whether we have an issue with that token. And it's created successfully for test@email.com. Google search. Yeah. I think I'll try that with git bash to see whether that will work. So we can call that and that would be to our HTTP. So that's HTTP. API. Yeah. So that's that. We have our test running and we have our token config. The next thing would be to commit and push to GitHub. Awesome. So I'll see our latest comment. So thanks for listening and bye.